The storm appeared on weather forecasts several days before it arrived. Meteorologists warned of heavy rain, strong winds, and the possibility of hail. Most people paid little attention. Storms came and went every year. This one seemed no different. They were wrong. On the afternoon, when the storm finally reached town, people hurried indoors. Parents collected children from school. Store owners locked their doors. Drivers searched for shelter. And one restaurant owner ran outside. Not to protect his business, not to protect himself, but to help a girl he had never met. Years later, people in that neighborhood would still remember the storm, but not because of the rain, not because of the hail, and not because of the damage it caused. They remembered it because, on one difficult afternoon, 4 lives crossed paths, and in ways none of them could have imagined, a community began to form. 10 years earlier, Mark Sullivan had lost his wife. For a long time, he struggled to imagine what life would look like without her, not only because he was grieving, because he was suddenly responsible for raising a 6-year-old daughter on his own. Lily had been brave. Children often are. Braver than adults realize. But courage did not solve practical problems. Someone had to pay the bills. Someone had to make dinner. Someone had to be there when school ended. And someone had to build a future. Mark spent months trying to figure out how to do all of those things at once. Eventually, he made a decision that many people considered risky. He opened a small neighborhood restaurant. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive, just a warm place where people could enjoy a good meal. Most importantly, it allowed him to stay close to Lily. Behind the restaurant was a modest apartment, not large, not luxurious, but home. While Mark worked, Lily grew up only a few steps away. When school ended, she could walk directly into the restaurant. When Mark worked late, he was never far away. The arrangement wasn't perfect, but it worked. For years, it worked. The restaurant became part of their lives. Birthdays were celebrated there. Homework was completed at corner tables. Christmas decorations appeared every winter. Regular customers watched Lily grow from a little girl into a teenager. And for a while, Mark believed they had found stability again. Then the pandemic arrived. Like thousands of business owners across the country, Mark was forced to close his doors. The dining room sat empty. The kitchen grew silent. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. With almost no income coming in, Mark and Lily survived on savings. Money that had been intended for the future. Money that disappeared faster than either of them expected. When restaurants were finally allowed to reopen, Mark hoped the worst was over. It wasn't. Many families had used their own savings simply to get through those difficult times. Eating at a restaurant became a luxury fewer people could afford. Some regular customers had moved away. Others came less often. Many were facing struggles of their own. The restaurant survived. But only just. Years later, the effects were still being felt. Food costs continued to rise. Utility bills increased. Equipment needed repairs. And the savings Mark had once relied upon were long gone. Now 16 years old, Lily worked alongside her father after school and on weekends. She greeted customers, served meals, cleaned tables, and quietly watched over her father whenever she thought he looked tired. Lately, she had been doing that more often because she noticed things. The stack of invoices on his desk, The repairs that kept being postponed. The long evenings after closing, when Mark sat alone reviewing numbers. He rarely spoke about any of it, especially around Lily. But she understood more than he wanted to realize. One evening, after the last chair had been stacked and the last dish had been washed, Lily found her father sitting alone in the dining room. The restaurant was quiet. Too quiet. "Dad?" Mark looked up. "Yeah." Lily hesitated. Then asked the question she had been carrying for weeks. "Are we going to be okay?" For a moment, Mark didn't answer, because he knew she wasn't talking about tomorrow or next week. She was talking about the restaurant, their home, their future. Finally, he smiled, a tired smile, but a genuine one. "We will manage." Lily nodded. She wanted to believe him. Outside, dark clouds were beginning to gather over the town. Neither of them paid much attention. Not yet. The next day began with rain. Nothing unusual, just a steady gray curtain falling across the town. By lunchtime, umbrellas had appeared on sidewalks and water flowed along the edges of streets. Most people assumed it would remain that way. Rainy, unpleasant, manageable. At the restaurant, business was slow. Then again, business had been slow for quite some time. A few customers had stopped by during the lunch hour. By mid-afternoon, the dining room was empty again. Mark was working in the kitchen. Lily was wiping down tables that barely needed cleaning. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Across town, 13-year-old Sophie Martinez left school. Like most students, she was thinking about getting home. Unlike most students, she was doing so in a wheelchair. Sophie had long ago learned that people often underestimated her. Sometimes they assumed she needed help when she didn't. Sometimes they spoke to her mother instead of speaking directly to her. And sometimes complete strangers appeared determined to solve problems she wasn't actually having. As a result, Sophie had developed a standard response, and she used it frequently. "I've got it." Usually, that ended the conversation. Her mother, Maria, worked as a journalist for the local newspaper. The job was unpredictable. Some afternoons she picked Sophie up from school. Some afternoons she couldn't. Both of them were used to that arrangement. Today was one of those days. Maria had called earlier. "I may be a little late." "No problem." "You sure?" "I've got it." Maria smiled despite herself. Of course that was the answer. By now she could have predicted it before asking. So Sophie began making her way home through the rain. For a while, everything seemed normal. The route was familiar. The weather unpleasant but manageable. The town moving through another ordinary afternoon. Then the wind began to change. The first person to notice wasn't Sophie. It was Lily. Standing near the front window of the restaurant, she glanced outside and watched dark clouds gathering over the far side of town. A moment later, she noticed someone else. A girl in a wheelchair, moving steadily down the sidewalk. Alone, Lily watched for a few seconds. Something about the scene bothered her. Not because of the wheelchair, because of the weather. The rain was becoming heavier, the wind stronger, the sky darker. She walked toward the kitchen. "Dad?" Mark looked up from a cutting board. "What is it?" Lily pointed toward the front window. Mark followed her gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply watched. The girl continued moving forward, determined, focused, completely unaware that she was being observed, or perhaps simply unconcerned. Mark looked at the sky. then at the girl, then back at the sky again. I don't like that. Me neither, Lily said. Outside, thunder rumbled somewhere in the distance. Not close. Not yet. But closer than before. For another moment they watched. Then Mark removed his apron. Lily smiled. She already knew what he was thinking. Come on. The two of them stepped out into the rain. Already half a block away, Sophie continued making her way home. A little wetter than she would have preferred, but otherwise perfectly fine. At least until she heard someone calling behind her. Excuse me. She turned. A man and a teenage girl were hurrying toward her through the rain. Sophie's first thought was immediate and entirely predictable. Oh no. Not this again. By the time Mark and Lily reached her, Sophie already knew exactly what was coming. Do you need some help? Mark asked. Sophie didn't miss a beat. I've got it. Lily exchanged a glance with her father. The rain continued to fall. The wind continued to rise. And somewhere overhead, the clouds were growing darker by the minute. For another minute, the conversation continued in the rain. Mark remained patient. Sophie remained unconvinced. And Lily was rapidly losing interest in the discussion. I appreciate it, Sophie said. But really, I've got it. The rain was falling harder now. Water streamed along the sidewalk. The wind tugged at jackets and rattled signs hanging above nearby storefronts. Mark looked toward the darkening sky, then back at Sophie. You still have a long way to go? Not that far. How far? Sophie hesitated. Far enough. Unfortunately, she knew that answer wasn't helping her case. Lily folded her arms. Look. Sophie immediately recognized the tone. Teenagers always recognized that tone. It was the voice of someone preparing to make a perfectly reasonable argument that would be extremely annoying. You can be independent tomorrow, Lily said. Sophie stared at her. Lily pointed toward the sky. But right now you're getting soaked. I'm fine. Sure you are. I am. Another rumble of thunder rolled across the town. Closer this time. All three of them glanced upward. The clouds had become almost black. For the first time, Sophie felt a small flicker of uncertainty. Only a small one. Not enough to admit she might be wrong. Certainly not enough to say so out loud. Unfortunately, Lily noticed. You saw that too. I saw a cloud. You saw a storm. I've seen storms before. Lily nodded. Good. Sophie frowned. Good? And you already know you're coming with us. For a moment, Sophie simply stared at her. The confidence, the certainty, the complete refusal to continue debating. It was surprisingly effective and extremely irritating. I haven't agreed to anything. No, Lily said. You haven't. Mark tried very hard not to smile. The rain intensified again. A sudden gust of wind swept across the street. Somewhere nearby, a loose sign banged loudly against a building. For the first time all afternoon, Sophie looked less certain. Not frightened. Just reconsidering. Lily noticed that too. Tell you what. Sophie narrowed her eyes. That usually means I'm not going to like the next sentence. Probably. Despite herself, Sophie almost smiled. Come inside for 15 minutes. 15? 15. And then? If the weather improves, we'll help you get home. Sophie immediately pointed to the flaw in that plan. You just said that I was independent. You are. Then why would you help me get home? Lily shrugged. Because I'm helping. The answer made absolutely no sense. which somehow made it difficult to argue against. For a moment, Sophie looked from Lily to Mark, then back to the sky. Thunder rolled again, even closer now. Finally, she sighed, not because she had been convinced. At least that's what she intended to tell herself later, but because continuing the argument seemed like more work than ending it. Fine. Lily smiled, not a triumphant smile, a relieved one. Fine, Sophie repeated. The three of them turned toward the restaurant. Halfway across the street, the first hailstone struck the pavement. Crack. All three stopped. A second hailstone followed. Then a third. Then dozens. Within seconds, the sound echoed across the town. Sharp impacts striking sidewalks, parked cars, rooftops, and windows. Sophie's eyes widened. Move, Lily shouted. For the next few moments, nobody argued. Nobody discussed independence. Nobody debated weather forecasts. They simply hurried toward the restaurant as quickly as possible. A few seconds later, the door closed behind them. The sound of hail immediately filled the room. Outside, the street disappeared behind a curtain of rain and ice. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Sophie looked through the window, watching hailstones bounce across the pavement where she had been only moments before. Slowly, she exhaled. And for the first time all afternoon, she began to wonder if perhaps Mark and Lily had not been entirely unreasonable after all. First, nobody said very much. The storm seemed determined to do all the talking. Hailstones struck the roof in rapid succession. Rain hammered against the windows. The noise filled every corner of the restaurant. Outside, the street was no longer visible. Inside, the three unexpected companions stood near the front window, watching, listening, waiting. Eventually Mark spoke first. Well, that was good timing. This time Sophie nodded. Only slightly. Not enough to be considered a full agreement, but enough. Mark noticed, and wisely chose not to mention it. I think, he said, we can safely say the weather forecast was correct. That earned the smallest hint of a smile from Sophie, the first one all afternoon. Lily noticed immediately. So you're capable of smiling. Sophie's expression disappeared at once. I've got it. There was no need for you. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Lily laughed. Actually laughed. What does that even mean? Sophie looked mildly offended. It means I've got it. You use that answer for everything. You've known me for 10 minutes. And yet I'm sure I am right. Mark shook his head, already exhausted by both of them. The storm continued outside. Inside, the atmosphere was becoming surprisingly comfortable. A few moments later, Lily pointed toward one of the tables. You might as well come over. I'm fine. Of course you are. Sophie narrowed her eyes. Lily smiled. Neither appeared willing to surrender. Finally, Sophie rolled toward the table. Not because Lily had suggested it. At least that was the version she intended to remember later. As she settled near the window, Lily sat down across from her. For a moment neither spoke. Then Lily extended a hand. I'm Lily, and that is Mark, my dad. The introduction seemed to catch Sophie by surprise. For a second she simply looked at the offered hand. Then she shook it. Sophie, nice to meet you. You already dragged me through a storm. Good point. For the first time, Sophie laughed quietly. Not because anything was especially funny, because the situation suddenly felt ridiculous. Outside, hail was bouncing across the pavement. Inside, she was sitting in a restaurant with two strangers she had met only minutes ago. Life was strange sometimes. Sophie's phone began vibrating. She glanced at the screen. Her mother. For the first time all afternoon, her confident expression softened slightly. She answered immediately. "Hi, Sophie." Her mother's voice arrived before Sophie could say anything else. "Hi, Mom. Where are you?" "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." Sophie smiled despite herself. "I'm at a restaurant." "A restaurant where?" Sophie looked around. For the first time, she realized she had no idea. She turned toward Lily. "What's this place called?" Lily pointed toward the front window. "The corner table." Sophie nodded, then returned to the phone. "The corner table." There was a brief pause. "The one on Maple Street." Apparently her mother knew it. "Yes. Stay there. I wasn't planning on leaving." "I'm serious." "So am I." Another pause. Then she heard her mother exhaled. "I'll be there as soon as I can." "Okay." "And Sophie?" "Yeah?" "I'm glad you answered." For a moment, Sophie looked toward the storm outside, then toward Mark and Lily. "So am I." That answer seemed to satisfy her mother. After ending the call, Sophie placed the phone on the table. "Your mom?" Lily guessed. Sophie nodded. "Worried?" "Always." Lily smiled. "My dad too." Mark glanced over from behind the counter. "That's because worrying is part of the job description." Neither girl argued. Because he wasn't wrong. For a while they simply watched the storm. The hail continued hammering against the roof. The sound was surprisingly loud. Eventually Sophie's attention drifted around the dining room. The tables. The chairs. The decorations. The menu board. And the complete absence of customers. A few moments later she asked a question. An innocent question. A completely reasonable question. "Is it always this quiet?" The words had barely left her mouth when she realized her mistake. "Oh!" Lily burst out laughing. Mark closed his eyes for a moment. Not dramatically. Just long enough to appreciate the situation. "I'm sorry," Sophie said quickly. "I didn't mean." "I know." The corners of Mark's mouth twitched. It was an honest question. Sophie looked mortified. Lily was enjoying this far too much. To be fair, Lily said, "Sometimes we have 3 customers." That only made Sophie feel worse. And somehow that made Mark laugh, which made the tension disappear almost instantly. And for the first time since entering the restaurant, Sophie relaxed completely. A few minutes later Mark went into the kitchen. When he returned, he carried a plate. He placed it in front of Sophie. The smell alone was enough to attract her immediate attention. "I didn't order anything." "No. I'm serious." "So am I." Sophie looked down at the food, then back at Mark, then back at the food. Suspicion appeared immediately. "I can pay." Mark and Lily exchanged a glance. Apparently this was another familiar phrase. "I believe you," Mark said. "Good." "But that's not the point." Sophie frowned. "What point?" Mark smiled. "The point is you're our guest." For a moment Sophie didn't know what to say. That happened less often than people might expect. Fortunately, Lily rescued her. "Besides," she said, "if you don't eat it, Dad will start asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "Questions about nutrition." Sophie's eyes widened. "Seriously?" "Terrifying questions." The expression on Sophie's face finally broke whatever resistance remained. She laughed. A small laugh, but genuine. Then she picked up a fork. "Fine." "Fine?" Lily repeated. "Fine. That doesn't sound very grateful." "It doesn't have to." Lily grinned. And for the next few minutes, The two girls continued arguing over absolutely nothing. Mark listened from behind the counter, smiling to himself, because for the first time in quite a while, the restaurant didn't feel quite so empty. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, something else had quietly begun. Nearly 40 minutes later, the storm finally began to weaken. First stopped the hail. Then the rain softened. The steady drumming against the windows became a gentle patter. For the first time in nearly an hour, the restaurant felt quiet again. A few moments later, headlights appeared outside. Sophie's attention immediately shifted toward the front window. "That's her." Lily looked outside. "Your mother?" Sophie nodded. A mixture of relief and resignation crossed her face. "She's going to worry." "I think that ship has sailed," Lily said. Sophie couldn't argue with that. The front door opened and a woman stepped inside. Her jacket was damp from the rain. Her expression was concerned. The moment she spotted Sophie, that concern began to disappear. Not completely, but enough. "There you are." "I'm fine." "Of course you are." The answer came so quickly that it was obvious this conversation had happened before, many times. Sophie's mother walked over and gently squeezed her daughter's shoulder. Only then did she seem to fully relax. For a few moments, neither said very much. They didn't need to. The relief was obvious. Finally, Sophie gestured toward the others. "This is Mark." Mark offered a hand. "And that's Lily." Lily waved. Sophie's mother smiled. "Thank you. Nice to meet you. I'm Maria." The words were directed to both of them. Simple. Sincere. You didn't have to do all of this. Mark shook his head. It wasn't a difficult decision. Outside, water still ran along the street. The evidence of the storm remained everywhere. Sophie's mother glanced toward the window, then back at Sophie, then toward Mark again. Perhaps she was imagining what might have happened if he and Lily had not stepped outside when they did. "Still," she said quietly, "thank you." Mark simply nodded. The dining room fell silent for a moment. Not an uncomfortable silence, just a natural pause. The kind that happens when strangers have finished discussing what brought them together and haven't yet discovered what might come next. Sophie's mother looked around the restaurant. The neatly arranged tables, the warm lighting, the quiet atmosphere. There was something inviting about the place, something familiar. And yet something else caught her attention. The restaurant was empty. Not closed, not neglected, just empty. As a journalist, she spent much of her life observing details. Sometimes details told stories. This place seemed to have one. Before leaving, she reached for her purse. Mark knew what was coming. "You don't have to." "I do." "No." Sophie's mother laughed softly. Apparently, she had encountered a stubborn person as well. "My daughter ate your food, and your daughter was our guest." For a moment, neither seemed willing to surrender. Then Sophie sighed dramatically. "Trust me." Both adults looked at her. "He's not going to change his mind." Lily nodded. "He's really not." The fact that both girls agreed on something was apparently enough. Sophie's mother finally slipped her purse back into her bag. "All right." Then she smiled. "But next time, I'm paying." Then she and Sophie made their way toward the door. Just before leaving, Sophie glanced back. Lily was standing near the counter, watching. Sophie hesitated for only a second, then lifted a hand. A small wave. Lily waved back immediately. The door closed behind them. Outside, the storm was ending. Inside, Mark began clearing a few dishes. The restaurant looked exactly as it had earlier that afternoon. The same tables, the same chairs, the same quiet dining room, and yet somehow it felt different. Neither Mark nor Lily could have explained why. Not yet. The next morning, the storm was the main topic of conversation throughout town. People discussed damaged roofs, broken branches, flooded streets, and hailstones large enough to surprise even longtime residents. At school, Sophie's teacher asked the same question many teachers were asking that day. "Did you get home safely yesterday?" "I did." The teacher smiled. "Good." That might have been the end of the conversation, except Sophie added, "I ended up hiding in a restaurant." Now the teacher looked interested. "A restaurant?" Sophie nodded. "The owner and his daughter wouldn't let me stay outside." The teacher laughed. "Wouldn't let you?" "Basically. And I assume you argued." Sophie's expression answered the question. The teacher laughed again. "That sounds about right." A few days later, the teacher noticed something. Sophie seemed different. Not dramatically, but noticeable. She smiled more often, participated more during discussions, and appeared definitely happier. One afternoon, after class, the teacher finally asked, "Okay." Sophie looked up from her books. "Okay, what?" "What changed?" Sophie frowned. "What do you mean?" "You seem happier lately." Immediately, Sophie became suspicious. That's a strange thing to say. Teachers notice things. Apparently that answer was acceptable, because Sophie returned to her homework. The teacher waited. Eventually Sophie sighed. "I've been spending time at a restaurant." "The one from the storm?" Sophie nodded. "The corner table." "And that's made you happier?" Sophie considered the question, then shrugged. "I guess." The teacher smiled. "You guess? It's become kind of a thing." "A thing?" After school, Sophie seemed uncomfortable discussing it, as though she suspected the entire subject was becoming unnecessarily emotional. "I stop there before going home. Every day. Most days." The teacher raised an eyebrow. "That often?" Another shrug. "I'm kind of a regular now." The words escaped before Sophie realized she had said them. The teacher noticed immediately. A regular. Not a customer. Not a visitor. A regular. "And the food's okay." The teacher laughed. For some reason, she suspected there was more to the story than that. A few days later, curiosity finally got the better of her. After school, she stopped by the restaurant. What she found surprised her. The place was warm, welcoming, comfortable. And near the front window sat Sophie, doing her homework, arguing with Lily about something completely unimportant. The two girls appeared to be enjoying themselves immensely. Neither would have admitted it, but it was obvious. The teacher stayed for dinner. A week later she returned. Then she mentioned the restaurant to another teacher, not because she was trying to help, because she genuinely liked the place. She felt welcome there. And without anyone planning it, word slowly began to spread. At first, Sophie's mother didn't think much about the changed afternoon routine. Sophie had always been independent. If she wanted to spend an hour somewhere after school, that was hardly unusual. But an hour gradually became 2, then 3, and before long, a new routine had quietly established itself. Most afternoons, Sophie could be found at the corner table. Sometimes doing homework, sometimes reading, most times arguing with Lily about subjects neither of them considered important enough to stop discussing. The arrangement seemed to suit everyone, especially Sophie. One evening, while driving home, her mother glanced across the passenger seat. "You know," she said, "you spend more time at that restaurant than you do at home." Sophie didn't even look up from her book. "It's warmer." Her mother laughed. "Our apartment has heating." "Better heating." Ah. That apparently settled the matter. For a moment, neither spoke. Then her mother asked the question she had been considering for several days. "What is it about that place?" Sophie thought about it for perhaps 3 seconds, which was considerably longer than most people received. "I don't know." "You don't know?" Sophie shrugged. "It's just nice." The answer sounded simple, yet somehow it felt important. Because Sophie was not a teenager who described many things as nice, especially not repeatedly. Later that evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, her mother found herself thinking about that conversation. As a journalist, she spent much of her time writing about budgets, development projects, council meetings, statistics, important things, necessary things. Yet increasingly she found herself thinking about something else. Neighborhoods, community spaces, the places where people met, the places that quietly became part of everyday life. Years earlier, those places had existed everywhere. Small bookstores, cafes, restaurants, local businesses, places where people knew one another's names. Many had disappeared. Some had never returned after the pandemic. Others were still struggling. And yet one small restaurant seemed to be accomplishing something remarkable. Not through advertising, simply by existing. The more she thought about it, the more interested she became. Perhaps, she decided, there was a story there. Not about a storm. Not about her daughter. And certainly not about heroes. A story about community. And why places that brought people together still mattered. A few weeks later, Maria finished her article. It wasn't about storms. It wasn't about rescues. And it wasn't about her daughter. Instead, it explored something many people had quietly stopped noticing: the importance of places that brought communities together. Small businesses, local gathering spots, the familiar places that became part of daily life. Places people missed only after they disappeared. The corner table too appeared briefly within the article. One example among many. Nothing more. At least that had been the intention. The response surprised everyone. Readers remembered a restaurant they had not visited in years, a meal they once enjoyed, a place to feel welcome and relax, a place they had somehow forgotten. Over the following weeks, people began returning. Not all at once, not dramatically. One table, then another, a retired couple coming for lunch, a teacher bringing a colleague. Parents from the local school began appearing after work. Former regular customers returned. Some for the food, some for the atmosphere, most because they suddenly remembered why they once had liked the place. One evening, Lily stood behind the counter and looked around the dining room. Nearly every table was occupied. Conversations filled the room. The sound wasn't loud, but it was constant, alive. For several moments, she simply stood there, watching. Her father noticed. "What?" Lily shook her head. "Nothing." But it wasn't nothing. For the first time in years, she wasn't wondering whether the restaurant would survive. For the first time in years, she was imagining what it might become. A few tables away, Sophie sat at her usual place near the window. Her table. At least she secretly thought of it that way. A backpack rested beside her chair. Books were spread across the tabletop. Homework sat mostly ignored. As usual. Every few minutes she became distracted by something happening elsewhere in the restaurant. Usually Lily. Occasionally food. Sometimes both. The front door opened. Her mother stepped inside, as she often did after work. For a moment she remained near the entrance, observing. People talking. Neighbors greeting one another. Teachers. Families. Students. Already regular customers again. The restaurant felt different now. Not because of her article. Because of the people inside. The article had only reminded them of something they already valued. Community. The thing that had been quietly growing there all along. Near closing time, the last customers finally departed. The familiar cleanup routine began. Chairs were stacked. Tables were wiped. Lights were dimmed. Lily carried a chair toward the corner of the room. Immediately Sophie rolled forward. "I've got it." Lily stopped. Slowly turned. Then smiled. "No." Sophie frowned. "No?" "No." Lily adjusted the chair in her arms. "Now, I have got it." For a second, Sophie simply stared at her. The realization arrived. Lily had used her own line against her. The betrayal was immediate and completely unfair. "You've been waiting to do that." "A little." "A little?" "Maybe a lot." For a moment Sophie tried to remain offended, tried being the important word. Then she laughed. Not the polite laugh she offered adults. Not the small laugh that occasionally escaped during conversations. A real laugh. Loud, unrestricted, completely unguarded. The kind that arrives when someone catches you by surprise. Mark looked up from across the room. Sophie's mother did too. Both smiling before they even knew why. Eventually Sophie regained enough composure to point accusingly at Lily. "I'm still helping." "Of course you are." Lily handed her a cleaning cloth. "Deal with it." That started the laughter all over again. Outside, evening settled across the neighborhood. Inside, the restaurant was finally quiet. Not empty. Never empty. Because some places become more than businesses. Some become part of people's lives. And sometimes, all it takes is one stormy afternoon to remind us that we belong to one another.